Now I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of comic strips from the time of their arrival on the scene in the mid 1890s until the arrival on the scene of comic books in the mid 1930s. So we're going to be looking at the influential and important comic strips up to that time. And then we are going to abruptly stop talking about comic strips completely and rarely mention them again. So we won't be talking about Peanuts or Doonesbury or Garfield or anything that came after 1935. But we're going to talk about some 1890s stuff. Newspaper comic strips became a thing in the 1890s. In fact, they didn't really take off until the mid 1890s. And here we have a representative panel from what was one of, and maybe the first, regular comic strip with recurring characters. It was called The Little Bears by Jimmy Swinnerton, who worked for the San Francisco Chronicle that was owned by William Randolph Hearst. And in 1893, he did several one-panel cartoons of this little bear character that was kind of a mascot of the newspaper. And by 1895, that had morphed into an actual strip where there were multiple images. Eventually, Swinnerton moved to New York and went to work for one of Hearst's larger newspapers. And when he did that, he left the little bears behind, and instead he started a new strip called The Little Tigers, because William Randolph Hearst loved tigers. Little Bears still appeared occasionally in single-panel cartoons now and then in the San Francisco Chronicle for the next couple of years after the strip ended. In the second half of the 1890s, these two guys were the principal figures in what became known as the New York City newspaper wars. Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, two of the richest men in America, both of them owners of newspaper empires that spanned across the country. But New York, being the largest city in the country, was the prime market. And both of these guys focused on their New York papers, and a lot of the stuff that first appeared in their New York papers would then be syndicated to other papers around the country. So something might appear in the New York paper, and other papers, something might appear in Hearst's paper, the New York Journal, and then it would also appear in other papers he owned around the country, but they would sort of lease out articles and material to newspapers that weren't owned by either one of them. So essentially, what was going on in New York would really affect how the news was consumed, not just in that city, but around the country, and ultimately globally. Well, William Randolph Hearst bought the San Francisco Chronicle in 1887, and remember that's where the Little Bears first started. In 1895, he bought the New York Journal and Advertiser. Pulitzer had bought the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1879. That was the beginning of his newspaper empire. In 1883, he had bought the New York World. Well, these papers, run by these two guys, were in heavy competition around the city, and therefore ultimately around the country, to get the scoops, right? To get the most copies of their paper bought by people, and that leads us to the comic strips. Because remember, 1895, we talked about how Jimmy Swinnerton Actually, it was 1897, Jimmy Swinnerton moved over there and started the Little Tigers for Hearst's New York Journal. There was another comic strip that had started that would be enormously popular. It was called The Yellow Kid, and it got its start in the New York World, owned by Pulitzer. It was drawn by Richard Outcault. And in 1896, he was hired away at a substantially higher rate by Hearst. So then he went over and he started doing The Yellow Kid for Hearst's New York Journal. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the sort of the concept behind the character in the comic strip in a minute. But essentially, when these things first started, the papers were black and white, and then they started introducing color. And so by having this character in this really, really bright yellow, oversized shirt, it would draw the reader's attention immediately to that strip. Well, after Outcault went to work for Hearst, Pulitzer kept publishing The Yellow Kid. He just got someone else to draw it. There was some disagreement over who owned the rights. Was the character owned by the creator, Outcault, and therefore something he could take with him, or was it owned by the newspaper who hired him to draw it, Pulitzer's paper? That never really got decided in the Yellow Kid's case because this only went on for a couple of years. But during those couple of years, both papers were publishing their own separate versions of the Yellow Kid. So people started referring to them as the Yellow Kid papers. And they started referring to their approach as Yellow Kid journalism, because these were the really popular papers in part because of the extreme popularity of the Yellow Kid. This was the first commercially successful comic strip and comic strip character. So that was eventually shortened to Yellow Journalism, which referred to the approach taken at that time by Hearst and also by Pulitzer of being extremely sensationalistic in how they presented the news, exaggerating things, sometimes to the point of even fictionalizing things in order to sell papers. Like, for example, when the U.S. ship, the USS Maine, had an explosion in its hold and sunk in off the shore of Cuba there. This was the headline in the New York Journal. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, and they offered a $50,000 reward for the capture of the perpetrator of the enemy that did this. And both papers were really drumming this hard, and it led, that sentiment led to the U.S. going to war with Spain. And a lot of the stuff that had been printed that got people outraged, turns out it could best be described as opinion pieces. Most historians agree that the sinking of the Maine almost certainly was due to an accident on board with the boiler. Now, there were other newspapers in New York. There were older newspapers in New York that were considered themselves more respectable, right? So they looked down on this yellow journalism, this jingoistic and sensational approach. And principal among these, the New York Times, which had been around since, I think, 1851. And it was during this period of the newspaper wars when Hearst and Pulitzer were competing as to who could be the most outrageous that the New York Times, beginning in 1897, started putting in this little box on their front page all the news that's fit to print. The implication being that their rivals were printing stuff that wasn't really fit to be printed. So all this ties in with The Yellow Kid, the first phenomenally successful. Well, let's talk a little bit about the actual strip. It didn't start as The Yellow Kid. It started as Hogans Alley, about an Irish immigrant neighborhood in New York City. And a lot of the early cartoons, before it became a strip, there were some one-panel cartoons. A lot of those sort of presented a picturesque slice of life about immigrant life. Now, bear in mind, this is just about 5 years after the publication of Jacob Riis's photographic expose about the poor living conditions of immigrants in New York City, how the other half lives. So initially, the Yellow Kid was just a minor character that showed up in these things, but quickly became very popular. By the way, I have to take into account that some of my students now aren't that familiar with the funny pages. So just for some background, on the Sunday paper they're in color, but through the rest of the week they tend to be in black and white. Anyway, the Yellow Kid was appearing all week long, and because of his popularity, he eventually took over the strip. The strip was called The Yellow Kid in both Pulitzer and Hearst's newspapers. What's really interesting is the fact that this character and this strip were so extraordinarily influential and important. Influential in sort of demonstrating that comic strips can sell newspapers, that they can be even sometimes the main draw. But despite that influence and popularity, it was only around for 3 years. Outcault went on to create another very popular and influential comic strip and comic strip character, Buster Brown, who was a little boy, and the comic strip was his adventures with his little dog. And Outcault licensed the character to a lot of different things because it was a popular character at the time in the early 1900s. But one of the long-lasting licenses that was granted was to a shoe company, and Buster Brown became the image of this shoe company for decades. In fact, when I was a kid in the 1970s and 80s, everyone recognized Buster Brown as the shoe kid. Most people my age had no idea that it had ever been a comic strip. I'm not sure they may still be selling them. Now we're going to talk about some of the influential and popular early comic strips, and we're going to begin with one we've already mentioned, the one that was produced by the German immigrant Rudolf Dirks and was inspired by Max und Moritz, the Katzenjammer Kids, or I guess the German pronunciation would be Katzenjammer. Katzenjammer Kids, which started being printed in 1897, again by Rudolf Dirks, and lasted with original strips for 109 years. Obviously not by Rudolf Dirks that whole time. In fact, Dirks was only with it for about 15 years. But during that time, the characters were established. Hans und Fritz were the two little boys, and then the captain was the guy they were always driving crazy. Now, you will notice in the panels that are represented here that all the characters who are supposed to be German or German immigrants have really exaggerated, really thick German accents, and that's the sort of thing that could be considered problematic and insulting. It is worth noting, though, that the creator of the strip, and the person who wrote and drew it for years was a German immigrant himself. So you could either look at it that, he was sort of buying into the prejudices of his new home and using that kind of as a statement to take advantage of, or that the fact that he did it made it okay. That's probably not the way to look at it. But the fact is, the characters would later go on to appear in comic books and cartoons, even television cartoons, as late as the 1960s. Now, in actually it was around 1912, 1913, Dirks kind of went to war with William Randolph Hearst, whose paper the Katzenjammer Kids appeared in, over ownership. It's similar to what happened with Richard Outcault and the Yellow Kid, in that Dirks left the employ of Hearst and took his characters with him, but he couldn't use the same name for the comic strip. So he changed the name to initially Hans und Fritz, and then pretty soon after that, the Captain and the Kids. So the same thing was going on as with the Yellow Kid. The original Katzenjammer Kids was still running in Hearst's papers. That's the one that was having new strips produced all the way until 2006 by a different artist. Then Dirks was doing his work with his characters at other newspapers. And this situation lasted for over 60 years, 65 years. There were competing strips about these audacious German youngsters. Finally, in 1979, Captain and the Kids was canceled, but the Katzenjammer Kids continued on. Like I said earlier, there were new strips being produced all the way up until 2006. However, just because they stopped producing new strips doesn't mean they stopped publishing it. Peanuts stopped producing new strips when Chuck Schultz died several years ago, but it's still in the paper because they're reprinting old ones, and they're still doing that with the Katzenjammer Kids as of the date of me making this video in the year 2020. There are some papers in the country that run this syndicated strip that you can pick it up and read it, making it the longest continually running comic strip in history from 1897 all the way up to now. Another very popular and successful strip in the early years of the 20th century was Happy Hooligan by Frederick Opper, which was also done for the Hearst newspapers. Had a decent run, 32 years, and yet, it's now been a long time. What is it, like 88 years since it ceased publication. However, there are some characters that are still referenced even today. Happy Hooligan was a hobo. That's him there with the umbrella. And his misadventures often included his two brothers, also hobos, Montmorency on the left, who wore a top hat and a monocle and acted well-to-do, but definitely was not. And then the other brother who was there to his right, Gloomy Gus, who just had a really negative attitude about everything. So sometimes if you're watching older or maybe even newer movies, you'll hear someone say, "Don't be such a gloomy Gus." People who even use that expression nowadays, if anyone still does, that's younger than me, I doubt it, usually don't know where it came from. Little Nemo in Slumberland by Winsor McCay was about a little boy named Nemo and the adventures that he had every night in his dreams. The strip ran for more than 20 years. McCay worked off and on for William Randolph Hearst, Sometimes he left for a few years and then came back, and the strip sort of went with him. It was very, very influential. He was well known for just the sheer beauty, for one thing, of his artwork and of his composition and of the ways that he incorporated dream imagery and psychological concepts into his art. He was revered by cartoonists such as Robert Crumb and Art Spiegelman, and is often spoken of as one of the very first real geniuses of the medium. Crazy Cat by George Harriman was also extremely influential. It had, an absurd premise, even for a comic strip. It was about this lovesick cat named Crazy, who has an unrequited crush on a violent little mouse named Ignatz, who tries to discourage the cat by constantly throwing bricks at it, for which the mouse is often arrested. Kind of hard to see how you could stretch that out into 20 plus years of story, but it was done. And really the importance of this strip was it lay in its absurd and surreal nature, both of the characters and the situation, and the very surreal landscapes that Harriman drew. This is maybe the most influential comic strip of the early years. Harriman was born in New Orleans, and he was biracial. He was of mixed race, African American and Caucasian. Mulatto was the word in use at that time. And this was during a time period, it was during the Jim Crow segregation era in the South, and even outside the South, a time when someone of African American descent would be seriously limited in what they could do and what they would be allowed to accomplish. So Harriman kept his racial identity, for the most part, a secret. He was photographed always wearing a hat because he was covering up his kinky hair, and sort of hinted around that he was of a white ethnic extraction. People somehow got the idea he was Greek, and he went along with that, and a lot of the biographies of him all the way through most of the 20th century referred to him as of Greek descent. But the fact is that by necessity in that time period, he was passing. So what that really does is that makes George Harriman the first really successful African American cartoonist. Mutt and Jeff by Bud Fisher started its run in 1907. Now, I mentioned earlier when talking about the Yellow Kid that he appeared throughout the week as well as in the weekend editions, but it was inconsistent and spotty. The practice of having a daily strip 6 days a week, not counting Sunday, was really successfully initiated by this strip, Mutt and Jeff, and it became the norm after 1907. These guys were still around when I was in high school in the early 1980s, so that was a pretty good run. 1914 saw the arrival of the first company to be established specifically for the purpose of syndicating comic strips. Now, before this, there had been syndication of a sort. What had happened is that each of the comic strips we've talked about so far started in a particular newspaper, like Mutt and Jeff started in the San Francisco Chronicle. And if they were successful there, they might be picked up by other individual newspapers, and it was the newspaper owner of the home paper that would arrange that. With this company's being established, King Features Syndicate, they owned the comic strips, the comic strips that were part of their program. So you might, if you were a cartoonist, you might try to get started in a local newspaper or a city newspaper of a major city, but your big hope after this point was you'd get picked up by King Features Syndicate or one of the handful of competitors that came along afterward, because then you would automatically be distributed around the country. So this was established by William Randolph Hearst and his manager for this syndicate, Moses Königsberg. König being German for king, that's where the name for the company came. King Features Syndicate, a unit of the Hearst Corporation. And they are still syndicating several strips that they own to newspapers. Now we'll quickly go through some of the other popular and influential and long-running strips from post-1914 and the creation of the King Syndicate, starting with Gasoline Alley by Frank King, that started in 1918 and is still running today, as is Barney Google, that started in 1919 by Billy DeBeck. Now, a few years into the run of that strip, Barney Google met a backwoods hillbilly who's really the personification of all the negative hillbilly tropes, named Snuffy Smith, who became so popular that the name of the strip was changed to Barney Google and Snuffy Smith in big letters. That one, too, still running. Not still running, a couple of strips that were popular for over 40 years, the Gumps and Polly and her pals, that were gone by the late 50s. Bringing Up Father, on the other hand, managed to go for 87 years, finally ending in the year 2000. Ripley's Believe It or Not definitely doesn't count as a comic strip. I'm not even sure if it counts as a cartoon, but it's in the newspapers, in the Sunday papers, in the comic strip section, and it has been since 1918. As far as I know, still is. 1924, Little Orphan Annie came on the scene. In 1919, there was a strip called Thimble Theater that featured as its main character a guy named Castor Oil. That's him on the left right there. And the strip for most of the 1920s was about Castor Oil's various unsuccessful get-rich-quick schemes, and the sort of the adventures of the rest of his family, including his skinny spinster sister, Olive Oil. About 10 years into the run of Thimble Theater, one of Castor Oil's adventures required him to charter a boat, and so he went down to the docks looking for someone who had a boat to charter, and he met a one-eyed sailor named Popeye. And over the course of that adventure, Popeye was such a colorful character, and he caught on so well that before long, Castor Oil was kind of an afterthought in his own strip. So it became Thimble Theater starring Popeye the Sailor Man. And as you are no doubt well aware, that would go on to lead to cartoons over the decades and even to a Robin Williams movie. by King Features Syndicate. Next time, we'll talk just a little bit more about comic strips, specifically a new kind of comic strip that came on the scene around 1929, adventure comic strips. And then we're going to talk a little bit about adventure-themed radio dramas. And we are getting very close to that magical mid-1930s time in the height of the Great Depression when the comic book was born.